My name is Chloe, and I'm 27 years old. For most of my life, I existed in the shadows of a man who barely acknowledged my existence, until his final years when guilt finally caught up with him. Standing outside the funeral home in my only black dress, clutching a single white rose, I wondered if I even belonged here. The whispers had already started, and I could feel their eyes on me like daggers. If you enjoy stories about justice and family secrets, please subscribe to hear more. And let me know in the comments what city you're from. I love connecting with people from all over the world. The rain had stopped, but the gray clouds still hung heavy over Millbrook Cemetery, matching the weight in my chest. I stood at the back of the gathering, watching as hundreds of people filed past my father's casket. Richard Blackwood, even in death, he commanded attention. Business associates, politicians, socialites, all dressed in expensive black attire, all here to pay their respects to a man who had built an empire from nothing. But I wasn't one of them. I was the secret he'd kept for 27 years. My hands trembled as I clutched the single white rose I'd brought. It seemed so small, so insignificant compared to the elaborate floral arrangements that surrounded his casket. Roses, lilies, orchids, each arrangement more expensive than my monthly salary as an elementary school teacher. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, his daughter, and yet I felt like an intruder at his own funeral. "Excuse me, are you family?" A woman in a perfectly tailored black suit approached me, her eyes scanning me with barely concealed disdain. She was tall, blonde, with the kind of polished look that screamed old money. I recognized her immediately from the newspaper photos. Victoria Blackwood, my father's widow. "I'm Chloe," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. Victoria's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "I see. Well, the family section is reserved for immediate family members. I'm sure you understand." The dismissal was clear, but I stood my ground. "I am immediate family. Are you?" Her voice was ice cold. "Funny, I don't recall Richard mentioning any distant relatives." Before I could respond, two young men approached us. James and Marcus Blackwood, my half-brothers, though they'd never acknowledged me as such. They were both in their early 30s, dressed in designer suits that probably cost more than my car. James, the older one, had inherited our father's sharp jaw and intense brown eyes. Marcus was softer around the edges, but carried himself with the same entitled air. "Victoria, is there a problem?" James asked, his eyes settling on me with obvious irritation. "This young woman seems to think she belongs with the family," Victoria replied, her tone suggesting I was delusional. Marcus let out a short laugh. "Oh, you're the teacher, right? Chloe, something. Dad mentioned you a few times." His voice dripped with condescension. "I have to say, showing up here takes some nerve." "I have every right to be here," I said, my voice stronger now despite the tremor in my hands. "Do you?" James stepped closer, his voice low but menacing. "Because from where I stand, you look like someone trying to capitalize on an old man's guilt. Dad felt sorry for you, sure, but that doesn't make you family." The words hit me like physical blows. I felt my cheeks burn with shame and anger. Around us, other mourners began to notice the commotion. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. I could hear fragments of conversations. "Who is she? Why is she causing a scene? Inappropriate behavior at a funeral." "I'm not causing trouble," I said, fighting back tears. "I just wanted to pay my respects." "Then do it quietly and leave," Victoria said firmly. "This is neither the time nor the place for whatever this is you're trying to accomplish." I wanted to scream at them, to tell them that their precious father had spent the last 3 months of his life getting to know me, that he'd called me every Sunday, that he'd promised to make things right. But looking at their faces, cold, dismissive, utterly convinced of their superiority, I realized it would be pointless. The service began, and I found myself pushed to the very back of the crowd, standing behind a group of business associates who occasionally glanced back at me with curious expressions. The minister spoke about Richard Blackwood's achievements, his charitable contributions, his devotion to his family. Each word felt like salt in an open wound. I listened as James gave a eulogy about their father's integrity and family values. Marcus spoke about the legacy Richard had built and how they would honor his memory. Victoria dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the grieving widow to perfection. Not once did anyone mention that Richard Blackwood had a daughter he'd abandoned for 27 years. When the service ended, people began to disperse. Some headed to their cars, others lingered to offer condolences to the family. I stood frozen, watching as person after person approached Victoria, James, and Marcus, offering their sympathies and sharing memories of my father. I wanted to approach them, to share my own memories of our recent phone calls, of the awkward but genuine conversations we'd had about my childhood, my career, my dreams. But every time I took a step forward, I felt the weight of their earlier rejection. "Chloe?" A gentle voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see an elderly man in a worn but well-maintained suit. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a warm smile that seemed genuine. "Yes? I'm Harold Pemberton, your father's attorney. I wondered if I might have a word with you." I glanced nervously toward the family group, but they were still surrounded by mourners. "Of course." Harold guided me to a quieter spot near the cemetery gates. "I wanted to express my condolences. I know your relationship with your father was complicated, but I could see how much you meant to him in these final months." His words brought fresh tears to my eyes. "Thank you. I'm not sure anyone else here would agree with you. Family dynamics can be challenging," he said diplomatically. "But I want you to know that your father spoke of you often. He regretted many things about how he handled your situation. Then why didn't he do something about it while he was alive?" The question burst out of me before I could stop it. Harold's expression grew sad. "I think he was trying to, in his own way, but change is difficult, especially when it involves admitting past mistakes to people who prefer to believe those mistakes never happened." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. "I suppose I should go. I don't think I'm welcome here." "Actually, I need to ask you to stay," Harold said, his tone becoming more formal. "There's a reading of the will scheduled for this afternoon at my office. Your presence is required." I stared at him in surprise. "Required? But they made it clear I'm not really family. Nevertheless, you're named in the will. I'll send you the address." He handed me a business card. 2:00 sharp. Please don't be late." As Harold walked away, I felt a strange mixture of hope and dread. What could my father have left me? A token gesture, perhaps? A small amount of money, with a note asking for forgiveness? Part of me wanted to skip the reading entirely, to avoid another humiliating encounter with the Blackwood family. But another part of me, the part that had spent 27 years wondering if I mattered to the man who had created me, needed to know. Harold Pemberton's law office occupied the top floor of a historic building in downtown Millbrook. The mahogany-paneled walls and leather-bound books spoke of old money and established power, exactly the kind of place where the Blackwood family would handle their affairs. I arrived 15 minutes early, my stomach churning with anxiety. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, offered me coffee and directed me to a waiting area furnished with antique chairs and oriental rugs. Everything about the space reinforced my sense of being an outsider in their world. At exactly 2:00, the Blackwood family arrived. Victoria swept in first, her black dress replaced by a sharp navy suit that screamed business. James and Marcus flanked her, both looking serious and professional. They acknowledged me with barely perceptible nods, before taking seats on the opposite side of the room. "Now that everyone is here," Harold announced, "we can begin." He led us into a conference room, dominated by a massive oak table. Crystal glasses and a pitcher of water sat in the center, along with neat stacks of legal documents. Harold took his place at the head of the table, while the rest of us arranged ourselves with careful attention to invisible battle lines. "Before we begin," Harold said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to remind everyone that this is a legal proceeding. The will I'm about to read was executed properly and witnessed according to state law. Mr. Blackwood was of sound mind when he made these provisions." Victoria shifted in her seat. "Of course he was. Richard was sharp as a tack right up until the end." "I'm glad you feel that way," Harold replied with a slight smile. "Now, let's proceed." He opened the document and began to read in his measured, professional voice. The first several paragraphs were standard legal language, establishing Richard's identity and his sound mental state. Then came the specific bequests. "To my beloved wife, Victoria Blackwood, I leave our primary residence on Maple Street, the vacation home in the Hamptons, and a trust fund in the amount of $5 million, to be managed by Pemberton and Associates." Victoria nodded approvingly. This was clearly what she'd expected. "To my son, James Blackwood, I leave 40% of Blackwood Industries, along with the position of Chief Executive Officer, and a personal trust fund of $3 million. James leaned back in his chair, satisfaction evident on his face. He'd been groomed for this role his entire life. To my son Marcus Blackwood, I leave 30% of Blackwood Industries, along with the position of Chief Financial Officer, and a personal trust fund of $3 million. Marcus smiled for the first time since I'd met him. Between James and Marcus, they would control 70% of their father's business empire. I sat quietly, waiting for the token gesture I was sure would come. Perhaps a small trust fund for my education, or a scholarship in my name. Something symbolic that would ease Richard's conscience without really changing anything. Harold continued reading, but his voice seemed to slow down as he approached the final section. And finally, to my daughter Chloe Matthews, I leave 20% of Blackwood Industries, a trust fund of $2 million, and the property at 1247 Riverside Drive. The room fell silent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Did you say daughter?" "I did," Harold confirmed, his eyes fixed on the document. "That's impossible," James said, his professional composure cracking. "Chloe isn't our father's daughter. She's just some woman who—" "Actually," Harold interrupted, "I have documentation that confirms otherwise. Your father acknowledged paternity 3 months ago and amended his will accordingly." "This is outrageous," Marcus sputtered. "She's obviously manipulated him somehow. A dying old man, feeling guilty about some ancient affair." "There's more," Harold said quietly, and something in his tone made everyone freeze. He looked directly at me, and I saw something that might have been an apology in his eyes. "Your father wanted me to read this final section aloud. He called it his last confession." Harold cleared his throat and continued reading. "I, Richard Blackwood, have spent my entire life building an empire, but I have failed miserably at building a family. I abandoned my daughter Chloe for 27 years, not because I didn't love her, but because I was a coward. I was afraid of what acknowledging her would do to my reputation, my marriage, my other children's opinion of me." Victoria's face had gone pale. James and Marcus exchanged shocked glances. "I have watched Chloe from a distance for years. I know she became a teacher because she wanted to help children who felt abandoned, the way she felt abandoned. I know she volunteers at the homeless shelter because she understands what it means to be forgotten. I know she has never asked me for anything, not once, even when I finally reached out to her." Tears were streaming down my face now. I had no idea my father had been watching me, learning about my life. My legitimate children have never wanted for anything. They have been given every advantage, every opportunity, every comfort that money can buy. They have never had to wonder if they were worthy of love. Chloe has had to earn everything she has, and she has done so with a grace and dignity that I never possessed. "This is ridiculous," Victoria snapped. "Richard never said any of this to me." Harold continued reading, ignoring her interruption. "I am giving Chloe not just money, but a voice in the company I built. She has more integrity in her little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. I trust her to use this inheritance wisely, not just for herself, but for the good of everyone who depends on Blackwood Industries." "She doesn't know anything about business," James protested. "This is insane." "And to my other children and my wife," Harold continued, "I hope you will find it in your hearts to welcome Chloe into this family. She is not your enemy. She is not a threat. She is simply a young woman who deserved better from her father, and I am doing my best to give her that, even if it's too late." The room was silent, except for the sound of my quiet sobbing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My father, the man who had ignored me for most of my life, had not only acknowledged me, but had given me a real stake in his legacy. "This can't be legal," Victoria said, her voice shaking with rage. "We'll contest it. We'll fight this." "You're welcome to try," Harold replied calmly. "But I should warn you that your husband was very thorough. He had paternity tests done, multiple psychological evaluations to establish his mental competency, and 3 independent witnesses to the signing of this will. Any challenge would be expensive, and ultimately unsuccessful." 20%, Marcus said, as if trying to wrap his mind around the number. That's a controlling interest if she sides with either of us against the other." For the first time since the reading began, I found my voice. "I don't want to control anything. I just want to understand why he did this." "Because he felt guilty," James said bitterly. "And now we're all paying the price for his guilty conscience." "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I think he did it because he finally realized that family isn't just about blood or money or social status. It's about love and acceptance, and giving people a chance to prove themselves." Victoria stood up abruptly. "This is far from over. We'll see you in court, Miss Matthews." "It's Chloe," I said quietly, And I'm not going anywhere. As the Blackwood family filed out of the conference room, their anger palpable, Harold approached me with a gentle smile. "That was very brave," he said. "Your father would have been proud." "I don't know what to do with all this," I admitted. "I never expected anything like this." "Your father left you some personal letters as well," Harold said, handing me a sealed envelope. "Perhaps they'll help you understand his intentions." I took the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of my father's final words to me. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, staring at the envelope Harold had given me. The outside was marked simply, "For Chloe," in my father's careful handwriting. Inside, I found 3 letters, each dated from the past 3 months. The first letter was dated from just after our initial phone conversation. "Dear Chloe, I know you have every right to hate me. I know that no amount of money or belated recognition can make up for 27 years of abandonment, but I need you to know that not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you. When your mother told me she was pregnant, I was 28 years old and engaged to Victoria. I was building my company, establishing my reputation, and I was terrified that a scandal would destroy everything I'd worked for. I made the cowardly choice to deny you existed, to pretend that you were someone else's responsibility. But I always knew. I always watched from a distance. I know about your college graduation, your teaching degree, your volunteer work. I know about the time you spent your own money to buy winter coats for your students who couldn't afford them. I know about the scholarship fund you started for underprivileged children. You became everything I hoped you would be, despite having no help from me. You became kind, generous, and strong. You became the person I should have been. I'm dying, Chloe. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. I want to use whatever time I have left to try to make things right. I know I can't undo the past, but maybe I can help secure your future. Please don't hate me more than you already do. Your father, Richard." The second letter was dated just a month ago. "Dear Chloe, our phone calls have become the brightest part of my days. I love hearing about your students, your life, your dreams. You have such a beautiful way of seeing the world, even after everything I put you through. I've been thinking about legacy lately. What does it mean to leave something behind? James and Marcus will inherit my business, but they've never had to struggle, never had to prove themselves. They take everything for granted because they've never known what it means to want. You understand the value of things because you've had to earn them. You understand compassion because you've experienced pain. You understand justice because you've lived with injustice. I'm changing my will. I want you to have a real stake in what I've built, not just a token gesture. I want you to have a voice in how my company moves forward. I trust you to use that voice wisely. Victoria and the boys won't understand at first. They might even fight you. But I hope that in time, they'll see what I see in you. Strength, integrity, and the kind of heart that can heal wounds instead of creating them. With love and regret, Dad." The final letter was dated just 2 weeks before his death. "My dearest Chloe, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I wish I could be there to see their faces when Harold reads my will. I wish I could be there to support you through what's coming next. I know my family will fight you. I know they'll try to make you feel like you don't belong, like you're not worthy of what I've given you. Don't let them. You have every right to be in that room, to claim your inheritance, to demand your place in this family. But more than that, I want you to use this opportunity to build something better than what I built. My company has been successful, but it's been built on the principle of taking what you can get and holding on to it at all costs. You have the chance to change that. Use your 20% to push for fair wages, ethical practices, community investment. Use your voice to make Blackwood Industries the kind of company that helps people instead of just profiting from them. I know it's a lot to ask of someone who's never worked in business before, but I've seen what you can do with limited resources and a big heart. I can't wait to see what you can do with the tools I'm giving you. Be brave, my daughter. Be kind. Be the person I never had the courage to be. All my love, Dad." I sat there for a long time after reading the letters, tears streaming down my face. My father had given me more than money or shares in his company. He'd given me a mission, a purpose, and, for the first time in my life, a sense of belonging. But he'd also given me a fight. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching Blackwood Industries. What I found both impressed and troubled me. The company was indeed successful, with interests in real estate development, manufacturing, and financial services. But there were also complaints from workers about poor conditions, stories of small businesses being driven out by aggressive expansion, and questions about environmental practices. I could see why my father had wanted me to have a voice in the company's direction. There was so much potential for good, but also so much that needed to change. My phone rang around noon. It was Harold Pemberton. "Chloe, I wanted to give you a heads up. The family has hired their own legal team. They're planning to challenge the will on the grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity." "What does that mean?" "They're going to argue that you manipulated your father while he was dying, and that he wasn't mentally competent to make these decisions." I felt a chill run down my spine. Can they do that? They can try. But as I mentioned yesterday, your father was very thorough in documenting his mental state and his reasons for the will. We have multiple witnesses, psychological evaluations, and detailed records of his decision-making process. How long will this take? Could be months, possibly years if they really want to drag it out. But Chloe, I want you to know that you don't have to fight this alone. Your father set aside funds specifically for legal fees related to any challenges to his will. He thought of everything, didn't he? He did. He wanted to make sure you'd be protected. After hanging up, I sat in my small living room, looking around at my modest furniture, and wondering how my life had become so complicated so quickly. A week ago, I was an elementary school teacher with a small apartment and a used car. Now I was potentially one of the heirs to a multi-million-dollar company, facing a legal battle with people who had every advantage money could buy. But I wasn't the scared, abandoned little girl I'd been for so many years. I was a woman who had built a life for herself, who had found purpose in helping others, who had learned to stand up for what was right, and I wasn't going to back down. The legal battle began in earnest the following week. Victoria, James, and Marcus had hired Thornton, Blackwood and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. Their strategy was immediately clear: paint me as a gold-digging opportunist who had taken advantage of a dying man's guilt and confusion. The local newspaper picked up the story, and suddenly I found myself the subject of public scrutiny. "Teacher claims inheritance from millionaire's deathbed confession," read one headline. "Family fortune in dispute over alleged daughter," read another. The attention was overwhelming. Reporters called my school, my apartment, even my neighbors. I had to take a leave of absence from teaching just to deal with the constant harassment. But for every negative story, there were also people who came forward to support me. Former students' parents wrote letters to the newspaper about how I'd gone above and beyond to help their children. Colleagues from the homeless shelter where I volunteered spoke about my character and dedication. Most surprisingly, several former employees of Blackwood Industries reached out to Harold's office with their own stories. They talked about unfair labor practices, environmental corners being cut, and communities being displaced by development projects. They saw my potential involvement in the company as a chance for change. "Your father was right about one thing," Harold told me during one of our strategy meetings. "You do have integrity. These people are willing to speak up because they believe you'll actually listen to them." "But I don't know anything about running a business," I protested. "What if I make things worse? What if you make things better?" Harold countered. "Sometimes the best leaders are the ones who ask questions instead of assuming they have all the answers." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the will reading. Victoria's legal team had filed multiple motions, challenging the validity of the will, the paternity tests, and even my father's mental state during his final months. I spent those weeks preparing with Harold and his team, learning about corporate law, studying the company's financial records, and trying to understand exactly what my father had left me. The 20% stake in Blackwood Industries was worth approximately $40 million. The trust fund would provide me with a comfortable income for life. The property at Riverside Drive turned out to be a beautiful Victorian house that my father had quietly purchased 3 months before his death, apparently intended as a gift for me. But more than the money, I was beginning to understand the responsibility that came with it. If I won this legal battle, I would have a real say in how Blackwood Industries operated. I would have the power to push for the changes my father had wanted me to make. The night before the hearing, I sat in my apartment reading through my father's letters one more time. His words gave me strength, but they also reminded me of the weight of what I was facing. I thought about the scared little girl who used to wonder why her daddy never came to see her. I thought about the teenager who had to work 2 jobs to pay for college, while her half-brothers attended elite private schools. I thought about the young woman who had chosen to become a teacher because she wanted to help children who felt forgotten. And I thought about the man who had finally found the courage to acknowledge me, even if it was too late for us to have a real relationship. I wasn't fighting for money. I was fighting for recognition, for justice, and for the chance to honor my father's final wish, to make his company into something that would help people instead of just profiting from them. The hearing was held in the county courthouse, an imposing stone building that had seen decades of legal battles. As I walked up the steps with Harold, I could see reporters and photographers waiting outside. The story had attracted regional attention, turning what should have been a private family matter into a public spectacle. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Victoria, James, and Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table with their team of lawyers, all looking confident and well-prepared. They nodded to various people in the gallery, family friends, business associates, people who had known Richard Blackwood for decades. I recognized some faces from the funeral, but most of the people in the courtroom were strangers to me. I wondered how many of them were hoping to see me lose, to see the outsider put back in her place. Judge Patricia Hendricks was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes. She had a reputation for being fair but no nonsense, someone who wouldn't tolerate legal theatrics or emotional manipulation. The hearing began with opening statements. Victoria's lead attorney, a polished man named Gerald Thornton, laid out their case with surgical precision. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is about a vulnerable elderly man who was manipulated in his final months by a woman who exploited his guilt and confusion. Richard Blackwood was a devoted husband and father who spent his entire life building a legacy for his legitimate family. The idea that he would suddenly decide to give away a substantial portion of that legacy to a virtual stranger defies logic and common sense." Thornton went on to paint a picture of me as a opportunistic gold digger who had somehow convinced my father to change his will while he was dying. He questioned the timing of the paternity acknowledgement, the sudden changes to the will, and my motives for reaching out to my father in his final months. "Miss Matthews may indeed be Mr. Blackwood's biological daughter," Thornton concluded, "but biology does not automatically confer the right to inherit. Richard Blackwood's true family, the people who loved him, supported him, and built a life with him, are the ones who deserve his legacy." When Harold stood to give his opening statement, I held my breath. So much depended on his ability to tell my story in a way that would make the judge understand. "Your Honor," Harold began, "this case is indeed about family, but not in the way Mr. Thornton suggests. This case is about a man who spent his entire life trying to balance his public image with his private conscience, and who finally found the courage to do what he knew was right." Harold walked the judge through the timeline of events, showing how my father had initiated contact with me, not the other way around. He presented the documentation of my father's mental competency, the witnesses to his decision-making process, and the clear, rational reasons he had given for his choices. "Miss Matthews didn't seek out Richard Blackwood," Harold said. "He sought her out. He spent 3 months getting to know the daughter he had abandoned, and he was impressed by what he found. He saw a woman who had overcome adversity to build a meaningful life, who had dedicated herself to helping others, who had never asked him for anything." Harold's voice grew stronger as he continued. Richard Blackwood wasn't confused or manipulated. He was clear-eyed and deliberate. He saw an opportunity to right a wrong, to acknowledge a daughter he had neglected, and to give her the tools to make his company into something better than it had been. The first day of the hearing focused on the technical aspects of the will, the signatures, the witnesses, the legal procedures. Victoria's team tried to find flaws in the documentation, but Harold's preparation was thorough. Every I was dotted, every T crossed. The second day brought the more personal attacks. Thornton called witnesses who testified about my father's devotion to his real family, his pride in James and Marcus, his love for Victoria. They painted a picture of a man who would never have intentionally hurt the people he loved most. But Harold was ready for this strategy. He called Dr. Sarah Chen, the psychologist who had evaluated my father's mental state just weeks before his death. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Chen testified, "Richard Blackwood was not only mentally competent, but he was remarkably clear about his motivations and goals. He spoke extensively about his regrets regarding his daughter Chloe, and his desire to make amends. He was not confused or coerced. He was thoughtful and deliberate in his decision-making." Harold also called Father Michael Torres, the priest who had visited my father regularly during his final months. "Richard spoke to me often about his spiritual struggles," Father Torres said. "He was deeply troubled by his treatment of his daughter. He felt that he had failed as a father and as a man. Making provisions for Chloe in his will wasn't a rash decision. It was part of his process of seeking redemption. But the most powerful testimony came from Maria Santos, my father's longtime housekeeper. She had worked for the Blackwood family for 15 years, and she had seen things that others had missed. "Mr. Richard, he keep pictures," Maria said in her accented English. In his office, he have photos of Miss Chloe, from when she graduate high school, from when she graduate college, from newspaper when she win teacher award. He watch her always. Victoria's face went pale. This was clearly news to her. He tell me one time, Maria continued. Maria, I have a daughter who is everything good that I am not. She help people. She care about children. She make world better place. I no deserve her, but maybe I can help her help others. Thornton tried to discredit Maria's testimony, suggesting that she had misunderstood or misremembered my father's words. But Maria was unshakable in her account. On the third day, I was called to testify. This was the moment I had been dreading, facing cross-examination from Thornton, having my life and motives picked apart in front of a courtroom full of strangers. Harold led me through my background first, my childhood, my education, my career as a teacher. He asked me to describe my relationship with my father, from the initial phone call to our final conversation. He called me on a Sunday evening, I said, my voice steady despite my nervousness. He said he was dying and wanted to get to know me. I was skeptical at first. I'd been disappointed by him too many times before, but something in his voice made me give him a chance. What did you talk about during these conversations? Everything. My work, my students, my dreams. He told me about his business, his regrets, his hopes for the future. He asked about my mother, about my childhood, about what I needed to be happy. Did he ever mention changing his will? Not directly. But he talked about legacy, about making sure his company would continue to do good in the world. He said he wanted people to remember him for more than just making money. When Thornton began his cross-examination, his tone was aggressive from the start. Miss Matthews, isn't it true that you contacted Richard Blackwood first? No, it's not true. You never reached out to him before he called you? Never. And you expect us to believe that you had no idea he was wealthy when you began these conversations? I knew he was successful, but I didn't know the extent of his wealth until after he died. Thornton spent the next hour trying to trap me in contradictions, suggesting that I had manipulated my father's emotions to secure an inheritance. But I had the truth on my side, and I stuck to it. Miss Matthews, Thornton said, his voice dripping with condescension, you're a elementary school teacher. What possible qualifications do you have to own 20% of a major corporation? I don't have traditional business qualifications, I admitted, but I have something else. I understand what it means to serve others instead of just serving myself. That's a nice sentiment. But business isn't about sentiment. It's about results. And what results has Blackwood Industries achieved under the current leadership? I asked. Profit margins, yes. But what about employee satisfaction, community impact, environmental responsibility? Thornton looked taken aback by my directness. That's not relevant to... It's completely relevant, I interrupted. My father didn't just give me money. He gave me a responsibility to make his company better. Maybe that's exactly what Blackwood Industries needs. Someone who cares more about people than profit margins. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and I could see some people nodding in agreement. Judge Hendricks called for order. Mr. Thornton, do you have any further questions for this witness? Thornton looked frustrated. He had clearly expected to rattle me, to make me appear greedy or incompetent. Instead, I had turned his questions into an opportunity to articulate my vision for the company. No further questions, Your Honor. The final day of the hearing brought closing arguments. Thornton made one last attempt to portray me as an unworthy outsider who had manipulated a dying man. Your Honor, he said, sentiment cannot override law and common sense. Miss Matthews may have convinced Richard Blackwood to feel guilty about their lack of relationship, but that doesn't mean she deserves to inherit a fortune she did nothing to build. But Harold's closing argument was masterful. He reminded the judge of all the evidence, the documentation, the witnesses, the clear testimony about my father's mental state and motivations. Your Honor, Harold concluded, Richard Blackwood wasn't a confused old man. He was a successful businessman who made a calculated decision to right a wrong and to give his company the best chance for a positive future. He saw in his daughter Chloe the integrity and compassion that he felt his company needed. This court should honor his wishes and his judgment. Judge Hendricks announced that she would issue her ruling within 2 weeks. The waiting was excruciating. I returned to my small apartment, trying to resume some semblance of normal life while the entire future hung in the balance. The media attention had died down somewhat, but I still received occasional calls from reporters asking for updates. My principal at Jefferson Elementary called to check on me and to let me know that my job would be waiting for me regardless of the court's decision. My students had made me a card with dozens of signatures, telling me they missed me and hoped I would come back soon. "We don't care if you're rich or poor, Miss Matthews," one of them had written. "You're the best teacher ever." Their innocent support meant more to me than all the legal arguments and media coverage combined. Harold called regularly with updates. "The judge is being very thorough," he told me. "That's actually a good sign. It means she's taking this seriously and won't be rushed into a decision." On a Thursday evening, exactly 13 days after the hearing ended, Harold called with news. "Chloe, Judge Hendricks has issued her ruling. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" "What did she decide?" "I'd rather tell you in person. But Chloe, you should probably bring tissues." I barely slept that night, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Had I won? Lost? Was there some compromise ruling that would satisfy no one? The next morning I arrived at Harold's office to find not just him, but Victoria, James, and Marcus already there. They looked grim but resigned, which gave me the first hint about how things might have gone. "Before I read the judge's decision," Harold said, "I want everyone to understand that this ruling is final. Judge Hendricks has made it clear that she will not entertain any appeals." He opened the official document and began to read. "After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony presented, this court finds that the will of Richard Blackwood is valid and enforceable. The deceased was of sound mind and was not subject to undue influence at the time the will was executed." My heart leaped, but Harold continued reading. "However, this court also recognizes the legitimate concerns raised by the plaintiffs regarding the disruption this inheritance might cause to the ongoing operations of Blackwood Industries. Therefore, this court orders that all parties must participate in mediated negotiations to establish a framework for Miss Matthews' involvement in the company that protects both her inheritance rights and the company's operational stability." Victoria spoke up immediately. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Harold explained, "that Chloe gets her inheritance, but you all have to work together to figure out how she'll exercise her ownership rights." "Absolutely not," James said. "We're not working with her." Judge Hendricks had anticipated this resistance. Harold continued reading. "Should any party refuse to participate in good faith negotiations, this court will appoint an independent mediator with the authority to make binding decisions about the company's governance structure." The message was clear. Cooperate or have the decision made for you. Marcus leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "This is insane. How are we supposed to run a company with someone who doesn't know anything about business?" "Maybe," I said quietly, "you could teach me." The room fell silent. Victoria, James, and Marcus all stared at me as if I had suggested something completely absurd. "I'm serious," I continued. "I don't want to disrupt your operations or destroy what my father built. But I also can't ignore what he asked me to do. Maybe there's a way for us to work together." "You really think we can just play happy family after everything that's happened?" Victoria asked, her voice bitter. "I think my father hoped we could try," I replied. "He left me letters explaining what he wanted. He didn't want to punish you. He wanted to give the company a chance to be better." James looked skeptical. "And you think you can make it better?" "I think I can ask different questions. When you're making decisions about layoffs, I can ask about the families that will be affected. When you're choosing locations for new developments, I can ask about the communities that might be displaced. When you're setting wages, I can ask whether they're fair. Those aren't business considerations," Marcus protested. "Aren't they?" I challenged. "Happy employees are more productive. Communities that trust you are more likely to support your projects. Fair wages reduce turnover and training costs. Maybe caring about people isn't just the right thing to do. Maybe it's also good business." Harold looked impressed. "Your father would be proud of that answer." Victoria studied me for a long moment. "You're really not going away, are you?" "No," I said firmly. "I'm not." She sighed deeply. "Then I suppose we need to figure out how to make this work." The mediation process took another 6 weeks. We met twice a week in Harold's conference room, working through the details of how I would participate in company decisions. It wasn't easy. There were heated arguments, moments when I thought the whole thing would fall apart, and times when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. But gradually, something unexpected began to happen. As we talked about the company's operations, its challenges and opportunities, I started to see glimpses of the people behind the hostility. James was genuinely passionate about the business and had innovative ideas for expansion. Marcus had a brilliant financial mind and could see patterns and opportunities that others missed. Even Victoria, despite her coldness toward me, had valuable insights about the company's public image and community relations. And slowly, very slowly, they began to see that I wasn't trying to destroy what they had built. I was trying to build on it. The breakthrough came during a discussion about a proposed factory closure. The facility was marginally profitable, and the numbers clearly showed that closing it would improve the company's bottom line. It's a simple business decision, James argued. We can't keep facilities open just because closing them would be inconvenient for the workers. But what about retraining programs? I suggested. What about helping them find other jobs? What about our responsibility to the community that has supported this facility for 20 years? That's not our responsibility, Marcus said. We're not a charity. No, but we're also not parasites, I replied. This community gave us 20 years of loyal workers, local tax breaks, and community support. Don't we owe them something in return? Victoria, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. What if we offered early retirement packages to older workers and partnered with the local community college to retrain younger ones for positions at our other facilities? James looked surprised. That would cost money. Short term, yes, Victoria continued, but it would also generate goodwill, good publicity, and it might help us when we're looking to expand into other communities. It's also the right thing to do, I added. For the first time since I'd met them, Marcus smiled at me. You know, that's not a terrible idea. It wasn't a complete transformation. We still disagreed on many things, and there was still tension between us. But it was a start. The final mediation agreement established a framework that protected everyone's interests. I would have full voting rights on major corporate decisions, but I would also participate in a mentorship program to learn about business operations. James would remain CEO, but major policy changes would require approval from all three siblings. Marcus would continue as CFO, with the understanding that financial decisions would include consideration of employee and community impact. Most importantly, we established the Blackwood Foundation, funded by a percentage of company profits, dedicated to education, community development, and worker assistance programs. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of Blackwood Industries, looking out at the city where I had grown up feeling like an outsider. The view from the 20th floor was spectacular, but what mattered more to me was what was happening inside the building. The mentorship program had been challenging, but rewarding. I spent mornings in the office learning about finance, operations, and strategic planning. Afternoons, I was back at Jefferson Elementary, teaching my 3rd grade class. It was exhausting, but I had never felt more fulfilled. The changes we had implemented were already showing results. Employee satisfaction surveys showed significant improvement. The retraining program for the factory workers had been so successful that 3 other companies had asked us to consult on similar programs. The Blackwood Foundation had funded new computer labs at 5 local schools and a job training center in the community where we had closed the factory. "Chloe, are you ready for the board meeting?" James asked, sticking his head into the conference room. Our relationship had evolved from open hostility to grudging respect to something approaching actual collaboration. He still thought some of my ideas were impractical, but he had learned to listen to my perspective before making decisions. "Ready," I said, gathering my papers. The quarterly board meeting included not just family members, but also outside directors and key executives. It was still intimidating to sit at that polished table with people who had decades more business experience than I did, but I had learned to trust my voice. "First item on the agenda," James announced, "is the proposed expansion into the Southeast market." Marcus presented the financial projections, which looked promising. The expansion would create hundreds of jobs and generate significant revenue. "What about local hiring requirements?" I asked. "And environmental impact assessments?" "Those are built into the proposal," Marcus replied. He had stopped rolling his eyes at my questions months ago. "Good. What about partnerships with local schools for internship programs?" "Actually," Victoria said, "I've been working on that. 3 school districts have expressed interest in career development partnerships." I smiled. Victoria's transformation had been the most surprising. Once she stopped seeing me as a threat, she had become one of my strongest allies in pushing for community-focused initiatives. After the meeting, I walked down to the employee break room, something that apparently no previous Blackwood family member had ever done. The workers were still getting used to seeing me there, but the conversations were becoming more natural. "Miss Blackwood," said Janet, one of the accounting clerks, "my daughter wanted me to thank you for the scholarship program. She's starting college next fall. That's wonderful, Janet. And please call me Chloe. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile. My father had given me more than an inheritance. He had given me the power to change lives. That evening, I sat in the Victorian house on Riverside Drive that my father had left me. I had moved in 3 months ago, and I was still getting used to having so much space. The house was beautiful, with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a garden that was just beginning to bloom with spring flowers. I had turned one of the upstairs bedrooms into a study, where I kept my father's letters and worked on my plans for the foundation. Tonight, I was reviewing applications for the new teacher training scholarship program. My phone rang. It was Harold. Chloe, I wanted to let you know that Victoria called me today. The family has officially withdrawn all legal challenges to your inheritance. Really? Really? James said, and I quote, "She's earned it." After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, thinking about how much had changed. A year ago, I was a struggling teacher who felt invisible to her own father. Tonight, I was a business owner, a foundation director, and, perhaps most surprisingly, a member of a family that was finally learning to accept me. I picked up one of my father's letters and read his words again. Be brave, my daughter. Be kind. Be the person I never had the courage to be. I thought about the scared little girl who used to wonder why her daddy never came to see her. I thought about the teenager who had to work 2 jobs to pay for college. I thought about the young woman who had chosen to become a teacher because she wanted to help children who felt forgotten. And I thought about the woman I had become, someone who had found the courage to claim her place in the world, to fight for what was right, and to use her voice to help others. Outside my window, the city lights twinkled like stars. Somewhere out there were children who felt abandoned, workers who deserved better treatment, communities that needed investment, and families who were struggling to get by. Tomorrow, I would go back to my classroom and teach 3rd graders about math and reading and kindness. Then I would go to the Blackwood Industries offices and work on decisions that could affect thousands of lives. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the life my father had made possible. And for the first time since that phone call on a Sunday evening, I felt truly grateful for the complicated legacy he had left me. I wasn't just Richard Blackwood's forgotten daughter anymore. I wasn't just a teacher from the wrong side of town. I was Chloe Blackwood, and I had work to do. The next morning brought a new challenge that would test everything I had learned. Marcus burst into my office. Yes, I now had an office, with a stack of papers and a worried expression. "We have a problem," he said. "Hartwell Industries is trying to buy us out." Hartwell was one of our biggest competitors, known for aggressive business practices and poor employee treatment. If they succeeded in taking over Blackwood Industries, all the progress we had made would be wiped out. "How serious is the threat?" I asked. "Very serious. They're offering our shareholders 20% above market value. That's hard for anyone to refuse." I spent the next hour learning about hostile takeovers, defensive strategies, and corporate warfare. It was like learning a new language, but one I needed to master quickly. "What are our options?" I asked. "We could look for a white knight, a friendlier company to buy us instead," Marcus explained. "Or we could try to raise our stock price to make Hartwell's offer less attractive. Or," James said, joining our conversation, "we could take the company private, buy out all the other shareholders ourselves. Can we afford that?" "It would be expensive," Marcus admitted. "We'd have to leverage everything, the real estate, the equipment, even our personal assets." I thought about what my father would want. He had built this company to provide for his family, but he had also wanted it to serve the community. Letting Hartwell take over would betray everything he had hoped for. "Let's do it," I said. "Let's buy back the company." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of financial planning, legal maneuvering, and strategic decision-making. I learned more about corporate finance in that month than I had in my entire life, but I also learned something else. I had good instincts. When the lawyers presented complex strategies, I could often see the human impact they had overlooked. When the accountants focused solely on numbers, I could identify the long-term costs of short-term savings. Most importantly, I learned that my family, and yes, I was finally thinking of them as family, had come to trust my judgment. "You know," Victoria said during one late-night strategy session, "when Richard first told me about you, I thought he was making a terrible mistake. I thought you would destroy everything we had built. And now?" She smiled. A genuine smile, not the polished social expression I had grown used to. "Now I think you might be the best thing that ever happened to this company." The buyout succeeded. Hartwell Industries moved on to easier targets, and Blackwood Industries remained independent. But more than that, the process had brought us together as a family in a way I had never expected. 1 year after that first terrible day at the funeral, I found myself back at Millbrook Cemetery. But this time, I wasn't alone. Victoria, James, and Marcus stood with me at our father's grave. We had come together to mark the anniversary of his death and to tell him about everything that had happened. "I think he would be proud," James said quietly. "The company is stronger than it's ever been." "The foundation has helped hundreds of families," Marcus added. "And we're actually a family now," Victoria said, putting her hand on my shoulder. "That's what he wanted most of all." I placed fresh flowers on the grave, not just a single white rose this time, but a large arrangement that we had all chosen together. The headstone was simple but elegant. "Richard Blackwood, beloved father and visionary leader." "I have something to read," I said, pulling out a letter I had written. "It's to Dad. Dear Dad, a year ago, I stood at your funeral feeling like an outsider. I was angry, hurt, and convinced that I would never belong anywhere. Your family, our family, made it clear that I wasn't welcome. But you had a plan, didn't you? You knew that the only way to force us together was to make it impossible for us to ignore each other. You knew that if you gave me a real stake in your legacy, we would have to find a way to work together. It wasn't easy. There were times when I wanted to give up, to take the money and walk away. There were times when James and Marcus and Victoria made me feel like I was crazy for thinking we could be a family. But slowly, something beautiful happened. We stopped seeing each other as threats and started seeing each other as allies. We stopped fighting over what you left us and started building something new together. The company is thriving. We're creating jobs, supporting communities, and proving that doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive. The foundation is helping children get better educations, workers get better training, and families get better opportunities. But most importantly, we're a family. A complicated, sometimes difficult, but real family. Victoria has become the mother I never had. James has become the brother who challenges me to be better. Marcus has become the brother who makes me laugh. I know I can't change the past. I can't give us back the 27 years we lost. But I can promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life honoring what you gave me. Not just the money or the business, but the chance to be part of something bigger than myself. Thank you for seeing something in me that I didn't even see in myself. Thank you for having the courage to do what was right, even when it was hard. Thank you for giving me a family. All my love, your daughter, Chloe. When I finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye among us. Even James, who had always been the most reserved, was wiping away tears. "He would be proud," Victoria repeated, her voice thick with emotion. As we walked back to our cars, Marcus fell into step beside me. "You know," he said, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad Dad changed his will, even though it meant sharing the inheritance. Especially because it meant sharing the inheritance. We're better with you than we were without you." That evening, the four of us had dinner together at the Riverside Drive House. It had become a monthly tradition, family dinner where we talked about business, but also about our lives, our hopes, our dreams. "I have an announcement," James said as we were finishing dessert. "Sarah and I are expecting our first child." The excitement around the table was infectious. Sarah was James's wife, a kind woman who had been one of the first family members to welcome me warmly. "That's wonderful," I said. "Have you thought about names?" "Actually," James said, looking slightly embarrassed, "if it's a girl, we were thinking about Chloe, as a middle name, to honor family." I felt tears spring to my eyes. A year ago, these people had refused to acknowledge me as family. Now they wanted to name their child after me. "I would be honored," I said. Victoria raised her wine glass. "To family," she said. "The one we're born with and the one we choose." "To family," we all echoed. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my study looking through photo albums. I had started collecting pictures of our family events, business meetings, foundation fundraisers, holiday celebrations, quiet dinners like tonight. My phone buzzed with a text from one of my former students, now in 5th grade. "Miss Chloe, I saw you on the news again. You're famous, but you're still the best teacher ever." I smiled, thinking about the balance I had found between my two worlds. I still taught 3 days a week at Jefferson Elementary. The other 2 days, I worked at Blackwood Industries. It was an unusual arrangement, but it worked for me. My students kept me grounded, reminded me why I had chosen education in the first place. The business gave me the resources to make a bigger impact, to help not just individual children, but entire communities. I picked up my father's last letter and read it one more time. Be brave, my daughter. Be kind. Be the person I never had the courage to be. I thought about the woman I had become over the past year. I had learned to be brave, to stand up in boardrooms full of powerful people and advocate for what I believed in. I had learned to be kind, to see past anger and resentment to find common ground with people who had hurt me. And I had learned to be the person my father had wanted me to be, someone who used power to lift others up instead of to tear them down. But more than that, I had learned to be myself, not just Richard Blackwood's daughter, not just a teacher, not just a business owner, but Chloe, a woman who had found her place in the world and was using it to make that world a little bit better. The clock on my desk chimed midnight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that my father's faith in me had been justified. I closed the photo album and headed upstairs to bed, grateful for the complicated, difficult, beautiful life that had grown from the ashes of that terrible day at the funeral when they ignored me, until the lawyer read the last line of my father's will.